go on, I should quickly mention, of course, probably most of you know that there is a current moratorium right now on the fast food sector's ability to draw temporary foreign workers. But from 2002 up until April of this year, fast food employers enjoyed relatively quiet and uninterrupted access to temporary foreign workers. And the period in which I'm talking about is the interim, so prior to the McDonald's scandal and the moratorium. So scholars are documenting that we're living through fairly profound changes to Canadian immigration policies that are associated with dramatic transformations in migration flows. Not only are more people entering Canada as temporary residents, but a growing number are doing so to fill positions in occupations that the Canadian federal government defines as low skilled. And they're doing so through a program called, it was originally called the Low Skilled Pilot Project, renamed last year to the Stream for Low Skilled Occupations. And what we see is that employers have really latched onto this program, whether that's for fast food, janitorial staff, construction, manual laborers, meat packers. Fast food employers have been given the means to look abroad, and they're absolutely doing so. In 2003, which was a year after the program was introduced, only 1,578 workers were employed under the program, compared to 30,267 in 2012. So really, employers are latching on to this program. These labor markets are becoming globalized. So what I'm particularly interested theoretically and empirically is this changing landscape to work in migration at the nexus of labor and migration. So what is it that we can see if we look at it as interconnected pieces? So I should say that my dissertation project was a global ethnography of this fast food chain. So what do I mean by that? Scholars are examining different levels of this changing landscape. So in the sending context, we have scholars like Goldring, Landau, and Prebish who are really looking at what this changing landscape has meant for Canada. And they've noted things like deepening social inequalities, a second-class category of workers, placing downward pressures on labor markets. Of course, there's also a sending context, labor-sending countries like the Philippines who are marketing and exporting their workers to countries like Canada. And we have scholars like Rodriguez, Ana Guevara, who are really looking at how the Philippines and other labor-sending countries do this. And the third dynamic is how this is changing work and employment in Canada. So from scholars like Peck and Bosco, we see the creation of flexible labor markets. And as separate fields of study, these bodies of literature provide us with really important accounts of these different components, right, at the nexus of work and migration. But what I'm interested in is how these processes are interconnected. In other words, what can we learn if we take different dynamics simultaneously to understand this whole picture, right? So I'm looking at this whole picture of this fast food labor chain from the policy here, the sending countries, the Philippines, the work site, and the individual. So what did I do? This is the research question that guided my project. How do multiple actors and institutions like employers, recruiters, government bureaucrats, workers, and states transnationally organize fast food work sites and labor markets under migrant worker programs? And this was the research design that I employed in order to carry out this project. So first I needed to figure out, is Tim Hortons recruiting workers? If so, what does the social dynamic of these flows look like? So I filed Freedom of Information requests in total 4, and from there I ascertained the gender, the source country, whether a third party or labor market intermediary was used, if so, who that was, and who these workers are. And from that I learned 78% are from the Philippines. Tim Hortons has recruited from 2005 to 2010 over 3,500 workers, and most of them are going to urban centers in Alberta. I also conducted semi-structured interviews with a host of actors involved in these transnational chains. Government bureaucrats, franchise owners, labor consultants, Tim Hortons accountant, attendant, Tim Hortons workers, settlement workers, union staff, so the host of people who are involved in shaping or intersect with migrant workers. And then I also conducted ethnographic field research in Canada and the Philippines. So that included doing things like participant observation at industry conferences in Canada, where Tim Hortons and other recruiters were present, recruitment fairs in the Philippines, attending Filipino pre-departure orientation seminars that are required for all Filipino workers going abroad. And this was the basis on which I organized my dissertation and made my empirical findings. From chapters 2 to 5 is the empirical findings for my research. And in the second chapter, which is regulating belonging, that's really where I trace how the expansion of the temporary foreign worker program came about, how Tim Hortons and the fast food industry was instrumental for lobbying for these changes, and how that has changed the context of reception for workers who are entering Canada under these programs, right? So increasingly flexible, increasingly precarious, limited opportunities to transition to permanent status. In the second chapter, I looked at how the Philippines brokers not only discipline workers for export, but also workers that are culturally appropriate. In other words, workers who are culturally trained to navigate life and work and employment in their host destination, like Canada. And then in chapters 4 and 5, I look at what that has meant for working conditions within the work site. So why Tim Hortons would even look for temporary foreign workers, and it's not just because they're cheap and disposable. Ask me later why. And consent behind the counter, I look how migrant worker dreams are in fact instrumental to shaping these flows, and which lead to a lot of exploitation and abuse of workers. I treat labor migration not only as an economic practice, but rather as a cultural and economic practice pursued by desiring subjects in pursuit of dreams. And I show how really the constellation of different dimensions of these flows, different actors from labor recruiters, consultants, sending countries, receiving countries are instrumental in stimulating certain desires and dreams amongst workers to engage. So why would a PhD from the Philippines want to come to work behind the counter of a Tim Hortons restaurant? It's not just for economic reasons. They've been led to believe by a host of transnational actors that this is an opportunity for them. And this was at a recruitment fair, and my contributions, I have three, which I can talk about later since I've run out of time. But I do want to say that this is a case study, while it gave me a lot of answers to how the fast food sector is doing this, why Tim Hortons is turning to migrant workers, it also raised a lot of other questions for me. Including the social dynamics of flows. Why do employers prefer the workers that they do? What stereotypes do they have about different countries?